one of the things that's really quite poorly understood about the region is the exposure of the people to the smoke. We don't all breathe the same air, and this was one of the first kind of interdisciplinary ideas of how to think about, these air pollution models suggest it's going to be this bad in Singapore or this bad in Johor Bahru, and we don't all breathe the same air.
Hello, this is John Sidel, the director of the Soswi-Hawk Southeast Asia Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE. Welcome to Dialogues on Southeast Asia, a podcast hosted by the center, which features discussions and debates with specialists in diverse disciplines and with different kinds of expertise on the countries of the region and on Southeast Asia as a whole. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Thomas Smith, or Tom, who's an associate professor in environmental geography at the LSE. He has a special interest and expertise in wildfires and their impact on local ecologies and the broader environment, and on climate change, most notably through greenhouse gas emissions. And he's conducted research on wildfires and their impact in a huge variety of different countries and regions of the world. So to get us started, could you begin by sort of situating your research in Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia regionally in this broader context of wildfires and greenhouse gas emissions across the world? How distinctive or representative, how significant is Southeast Asia in terms of the bigger picture across the world?
Yeah, hi, John. I've worked on wildfires in quite a few different places, not just in Southeast Asia. The savannas of Northern Australia, that's where I spent my PhD, the boreal forests of Canada, Banff National Park, the heathlands of Northumberland here in the UK as well, and of course the peatlands of Malaysia and Indonesia. And a lot of my work focuses on the gases in the smoke, but I also work on fire behavior. And each one of those ecosystems, in each one, the fire behaves in a very different way. So it tends to be unique to a particular ecosystem. And what I mean by fire behavior is how fast does the fire spread? What is the intensity of the fire? How big are the flames? Is it smoldering? Is it flaming? And to explain the fire regime of a particular ecosystem, it's useful to think of wildfire in terms of a triangle. So do you remember learning about the fire triangle in chemistry classes?
Sadly, no.
No, okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. It all came back to me during my PhD, but a fire requires oxygen, fuel, and heat. And a wildfire is slightly different. We need to think of things in terms of the dry weather conditions. It also requires fuel, of course, and you also need an ignition. So those are the three ingredients for a wildfire. And once you understand those three different elements, you can explain the variability in how a fire behaves across the whole planet. So wildfires are a function of climate, what fuel is available to burn, and also the ignitions. And all three of those things are affected by humans in some way, and in different amounts depending on where you go in the world. So in tropical Australia, it's the savanna fuels. They tend to burn every year or every 2 years. They dry out in the dry season. Ignitions mostly come from people. That practice has been around for thousands of years. In Canada, you've got the accumulation of pine needles on the floor of the forest, dead wood, and that can be ignited by lightning, but also by people as well. Thinking about the UK, it's the heather, it's the gorse, it's the grasses. They dry out during a short spell of dry weather, often ignited by people, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. There are actually very few ecosystems on the planet where fire doesn't play any role in some way. Stimulating regrowth, triggering seed germination. And if we think of these ecosystems that are fire-free, it's the deserts. So the Sahara, Antarctica, there's nothing to burn. So you're missing that fuel component of the wildfire triangle. But the other ecosystem is the rainforests. So what's missing there is the fire weather. It's too wet. It's wet all year round. and it's very unlikely you're going to have a fire in these very wet environments. And that is a long way around to explaining what the first thing about Southeast Asia that is unique. If we think about where I work, which is in equatorial Southeast Asia, so Malaysia, Indonesia, these countries lie close to the equator. So they have 2 wet seasons each year and 2 dry seasons. And that's critical for the fire regime of these countries, because unlike other tropical locations where there's just 1 wet and 1 dry season, like in northern Thailand or northern Australia, the regions that lie close to the equator, they get rain all year round, and that's what makes the planet's tropical rainforests. You know, they hug the equator. Think of where the Amazon is, the Congo Basin, and if you look at a satellite image of the Earth, you'll see there's this belt of dark green. And even if one of those 2 wet seasons is particularly dry, or even both of them, that forest canopy in the equatorial tropics kind of maintains the moist environment, and so you don't get the fire starting because it's just wet all year round. And you know, that's where we get to this first distinctive characteristic of where I work, because it does have fire, and we know this. It's characteristic of the region. Anyone who's been to Singapore, to Kuala Lumpur, or had the pleasure of traveling through Indonesia in September, October, can almost guarantee to smell the kind of peaty, kind of almost like a peaty whiskey smell in the air, and that's coming from the fires on these peatlands. And you know, why is this? If you think about the wildfire triangle, it's not the weather that's changing. There is climate change in equatorial Southeast Asia. It's warming up, but what is changing is the fuel. We've got deforestation, we've got drainage, and it's changing the kind of complexity of the fuels. You know, you once had this drought-resistant forest that could survive a year or so without rain, but now we've got grasses and shrubs, and these are not resilient to short periods of dry weather. They dry out and become available to burn. So you're changing the fire behavior in the ecosystem by disturbing the forest. Do you know much about the Mega Rice project in central Kalimantan? So 1996, under Suharto, 1 million hectares of tropical peat swamp forest were cleared near Palangkaraya, which is actually close to where the new capital city might be for Indonesia. 1 million hectares, that's about 6 times the size of Greater London. So it's a huge area. And the plan was to convert it all to rice paddy fields to alleviate Indonesia's growing food shortages at the time. And what they realized after removing all of that pristine tropical peat swamp forest was that the peat soil it's highly acidic, it's not suitable for growing rice, and ultimately the project failed. So the land was abandoned, and it was soon covered in grasses and shrubs. And anyone who has lived in Southeast Asia and is older than, I don't know, about 25 will know that in 1997, 98, all of that project burned during the mega El Nino. And the problem here is, and this is what's quite unique, is that efforts to reforest this 1 million hectares in central Kalimantan are going to be thwarted by these fires, because every time a fire comes along, it wipes out any new growth. So you've got this new kind of feedback system that keeps the forest stuck, or what used to be a forest stuck in a grassland or shrubland state. So yeah, that's one of the things that's unique about Southeast Asia. But I guess the important thing here is there's fires in the Amazon. So there may be some fires in the Congo Basin. So what is it about equatorial Southeast Asia that makes it different? Well, it's the scale of the deforestation. That's what's unique. Only 6% of the pre-industrial extent of the Sunderland region's tropical lowland forest. So that's Borneo, Java, Sumatra. Just 6% of the pre-industrial extent of the forest remains. So compare that with the Amazon, there's about 83% of the Amazon left. So there's a huge difference in the amount of deforestation that's been going on. And so, this has shifted the fire regime for an entire region from what was once quite fire resilient landscape to a fire prone landscape. So that's number one unique aspect of the region. But can we talk about peat?
Absolutely. Peatlands are clearly crucial here.
Yeah, so that's the other distinct and significant characteristic of the degraded landscape. So the Amazon, mostly mineral soil. It's quite hilly. You don't have the accumulation of organic matter under kind of swampy conditions, whereas most of equatorial Southeast Asia consists of peat soils. And under the forested conditions, those soils are going to be waterlogged. They accumulate deep layers of this organic material. It's a huge carbon store. So I've been prepping some statistics for you, but the peatlands of equatorial Southeast Asia, which cover just 0.3% of the Earth's surface, contain 20% of the world's soil carbon. So we're talking about a very small portion of the Earth's land surface, and even quite a small portion really of Indonesia and Malaysia. It's only really the coastal areas of Borneo, Sumatra contain this huge wealth of carbon. And the problem here is there's only 7% of the forest left. So a lot of that peat soil is now exposed to sunlight. It dries out. Most of these areas that have been deforested is very characteristic of the region. You'll see kilometers and kilometers of drainage canals. So all that water that was stored in the peat is flowing off out to sea. And so, yeah, the peat's drying out. It's exposed to the air. It starts to decompose. And unfortunately, when you have these fires spreading through the new grasses and shrubs that are growing on top of the soil, when it's dry enough, it will ignite. It will ignite the soil. So you get a lot of emissions of carbon from peat very quickly, rather than the slower emissions from decomposition. So, and if we want to put it into perspective and we think about the impacts, 1997-98, very specific areas of Sumatra, Kalimantan, they were estimated to be responsible for carbon emissions that equated to 15 to 40% of global fossil fuel emissions in the same period.
Wow.
That's an incredible statistic. A lot of uncertainty there, and we'll come on to that 15 to 40%, because that's what some of my work has been trying to address. But the other factor here is that, unlike a fire in above ground vegetation, so you may imagine a flaming fire in California or something like this, the carbon that's lost is not going to reappear anytime soon on the ground. The peat takes thousands of years to accumulate. So it's a net emission of carbon to the atmosphere when you burn peat. So it is just like burning fossil fuels. But it's not just the carbon, as anyone knows. You have this haze pollution. That's the word that is used in the region to describe poor air quality that comes from fires, the smoke, or we might call it smog. And it's an air pollution crisis that is very unique to this region of the world. There are other places in the world that have smoke seasons. Thinking about also in Southeast Asia, but the northern kind of Mekong region, northern India as well. But there is something quite different about the smoke from these peat fires. The fires smolder. They don't flame with big, huge kind of flames. It smolders like a cigarette, and it smolders deep into the soil. And the fires can burn for weeks or months in one place rather than spreading, because it's going down rather than across the landscape. And as such, and they're very difficult to put out as well. You end up this really kind of longer lasting haze season with very unique type of smoke because it's smoldering combustion. I don't want to get too technical, but that's not efficient combustion. Efficient combustion converts most of the fuel into CO2. It's not great for climate change, but CO2 it's not going to massively harm you. But all of the particulates and some of the toxic gases that are released because of the smoldering combustion end up forming the haze downwind. So when you combine this kind of unique burning conditions, this smoldering conditions, with the region's really high population density, you've got tens of millions of people being exposed to this smoke. And this happens almost every year. It was only really in the strong La Nina years when there's a lot of rain do we not see the fires. And I often describe these as the most destructive and deadly environmental issues on the planet. The air pollution from the fires in 2015 were estimated to be responsible for the untimely deaths of over 100,000 people, and that could be considered one of the worst environmental disasters.
So, for terrible reasons, you've highlighted Southeast Asia really is a strikingly significant region in the global context in terms of wildfires and their impact. In terms of these wildfires, their causes and their consequences, could you give us a sense of what among serious experts, scholars, and others is already well known, well understood, and what isn't? You mentioned, the possibility of 15 to 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But if you go back, for example, to the issue of the causes, already in the 1950s, there was a debate about so-called slash and burn or swidden agriculture. Already by the 1980s, there was concern about deforestation. And over the past 20 plus years, there's been a lot of attention to the impact of different commodity booms, most notably, famously or infamously, the expansion of palm oil plantations across Borneo, in particular parts of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. What do you think is already well established and we can take as given? And then what do you think really is, crying out for more research and analysis in terms of both the causes and the consequences?
Yeah, the problem here is that fire science is quite a young discipline. Really, people have been working on fire for less time than they've been working on sending people to the moon. It was developed in the States in the 1960s following a number of smoke jumper disasters. And for a long time, it was the American science that led the way with the scientific understanding of fire. There's been a long-standing knowledge base in indigenous communities about fire, but the focus on how fire behaves, the ecological impacts, the content of the smoke, all of that research has been led by the US. And as a result of that, there's been a bias towards understanding flaming fires in the kind of ecosystems that you find in the US. There's quite a lot of different ecosystems, but they don't have peat. There's one thing that you don't find, maybe in very small localized places, but it's not a widespread fuel for wildfires. So there hasn't been a great deal of work on peat fires. So there's a lot of unknowns, particularly about the emissions, the content of the smoke, and I'll come on to that. But regarding the ecological impacts, what do we know? Well, we know for sure that these fires are exclusively caused by human activities. They simply wouldn't happen without some kind of degradation to the forest, or either the drainage or the deforestation itself. And once the forest is burned, then you have this feedback loop, and that's quite well established. That we don't have ecosystem climax. You burn the forest and you leave it, it's not going to come back, because you've got these new feedback loops that are going to keep it in a non-forested state. So this is wildfire ecology. And similarly, if you leave the forest as it is, it's unlikely that a fire is going to encroach because it's wet all of the time. So we know that the ecological impact on the vegetation is massive. But what about the wildlife? Obviously, the region very famous for Sumatran tigers in these tropical lowland forests. I've worked in Jambi National Park on the island of Burback National Park, which is in the province of Jambi, and still a viable population of Sumatran tigers there. Very small pocket of forest that's left, part of that 6 or 7% of the original extent. But I was sharing a lodging house last year. I was really fortunate to be hosted by the Borneo Nature Foundation in Kalimantan, and they do a lot of work on primates. So I was sharing a lodging with some orangutan researchers who are working in the Sebangau forest, which is where we were also working, but we were deploying air pollution sensors. And there's a really interesting kind of crossover in the work, completely different disciplines sharing this house, but we got talking and found it very interesting that their research focuses on the calls of the orangutans. So they do audio surveys with microphones, and the calls have been dramatically altered by their exposure to the smoke, just like smokers end up with a coarse voice. The orangutans do as well, and it suggests that their respiratory systems are heavily affected by the smoke. It's not just human health that we need to worry about. And I came face to face with an old male orangutan on my final day in the forest. I had to return to fix our equipment because some of the other orangutans, I reckon, had found our monitoring station and ripped it apart, tried to eat bits of it, and then tossed the equipment all over the forest floor. So to kind of gather that all back together. And I like to think he came back to claim kind of a proud responsibility maybe, but it taught me a thing or two about disguising air quality monitoring equipment better.
Can't monkey around with it.
Yeah, but so that's the ecological impacts. But what was well understood about the smoke? Well, very, very little indeed. If we think about the uncertainty, 15 to 40%, the reason for that uncertainty, and at the time, 10 years ago, 1997, 98, the air quality forecasts were simply just not working. They'd often get things wrong by a factor of 2 or 3. And the reason for that was there was no baseline data. So no one had ever measured smoke from these tropical peatland fires, not even the Americans. And if a fire on peatland was detected, the models that feed into the air quality forecasting or national greenhouse gas accounting, they would just simply assume that it was a forest fire rather than a peat fire. And they're completely different types of combustion. And we're beginning to finally scratch the surface, excuse the pun, the necessary baseline data now, thanks to research from some of the projects that I've been working on in Malaysia and Indonesia, along with my academic rivals who are at NASA. They've started to get interest in this region as well. And yeah, I was going to ask, do you want me to tell you why I ended up working on peat fires in Southeast Asia? Because it kind of ties some of this together.
Sure. Yeah.
So I developed this method for measuring smoke for my PhD on the ground. So previously, you'd have to fly a plane through the smoke, suck it into a bag, or you'd have to go and suck it into a bag on the ground, which is very difficult. But I can use like this method where you beam some light through the smoke and detect it on the other side. It tells you what's in the smoke in terms of the gases. And I was doing that in Northern Australia. And at the end of my PhD, I got to go to Brunei. King's College London, which is where I did my PhD, had this relationship with Brunei at the time. And they ran this PhD conference. And if there are any people who are listening and have the opportunity to go to a conference like this, I just thoroughly recommend it. And I was there. There was a consortium of different universities, including King's, but Monash Malaysia were there. The Monash University have a campus in Kuala Lumpur. And I sat through about 12 presentations from PhD students on peat. And, I'd never heard of peat before, it was right at the back of my mind. I never ever thought I'd be interested in studying soil. That was the part of geography that I absolutely hated. But I was reading about the fires as they were, discussing this in their presentations, and I found that no one had measured smoke before, and I was like, well, I could take my equipment there and do it for the first time, and it would be a huge advance on the current state of knowledge. At the time, one study had burned some peat from Indonesia, about the size of an ice cream tub, on a barbecue, and it turned out that all of the air quality forecast models and all of the national greenhouse gas accounting for Indonesia and Malaysia, all of the estimates were based on this one sample of peat that had burned on a barbecue somewhere in a lab. And so there had been no field measurements, and that was where my research came in, and we were the first to measure fires in 2015.
Wow, game changer.
Yeah, it kicked off my career, I guess. It was at the end of my PhD, and I thought, well, this is what I should try and do next.
Great.
Mm.
So, in terms of your research, scholars of Southeast Asia can often demonstrate forms of sort of interdisciplinarity in their research, in their knowledge, and their understanding of different issues and questions in the region. But in your case, the interdisciplinarity is quite strikingly broad, spanning the social sciences as well as, the sciences themselves. And I'm wondering, are there many other people working on Southeast Asia who have that particular combination of skills and expertise and knowledge, and what are the possibilities that opens up? What are the real challenges there? If we have listeners who are thinking of going on to engage in new forms of research, what would you sort of advise and encourage in this regard? Because it's really quite unusual and impressive, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think there must be people out there who have both the physical science and social science skills, whether they're working on peat fires in Southeast Asia or not. I'm not too sure, but I think it's a unique set of circumstances that came together for me to end up transitioning more into research in the social sciences. I think the move to LSE helped a lot. Joining the Southeast Asia Centre, meeting some of the affiliates, and getting some of my collaborators involved in the Southeast Asia Centre as well. That has helped bring a whole group of different people together to exchange ideas. I think the funding structure has helped a little bit as well. So the UK government's has pushed quite a lot of the ODA money, the overseas development cash, towards addressing some of the key challenges, and that must be interdiscipline in nature. So one of the things that's really quite poorly understood about the region is the exposure of the people to the smoke. We don't all breathe the same air, and this was one of the first kind of interdisciplinary ideas I had, is to think about, well, these air pollution models suggest it's going to be this bad in Singapore or this bad in Johor Bahru, and we don't all breathe the same air. So take London, for example, or the rest of the UK. Wealthy homeowners are installing wood burners in their homes, and it's at such a rate that domestic solid fuel burning is now responsible for more particulate pollution than vehicles. So, which is an incredible
Are these
statistic.
AGA owners or just?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Anything that burns solid fuel is about 200 to 300 times more polluting than a gas boiler. So
Wow.
So less than 10% of the households in the UK are polluting more than all of the cars and lorries on the road. And I've been really interested in the inequalities in access to clean air in Southeast Asia, because people have different kind of standards of housing. People have different jobs. Some have to work outdoors, some work indoors. There's a gender aspect to this as well. And so that's why I was in Kalimantan last year, because we were installing a network of air pollution sensors inside people's homes, outside people's homes, to have a look at the variability at the really fine scale that might be related to kind of issues of demography, gender, types of jobs, things like that. And that, necessarily requires working with social scientists as well. We need to bring them on board. They need to do their questionnaires. They need to interview the people who are hosting the air pollution sensors. And it's been a really interesting experience working with the social scientists at the University of Palangkaraya and Leeds here in the UK. So that's just one example. I kind of forgotten your question now.
It was about the interdisciplinarity of your research, and I guess also the collaborative nature of it. But could you give our listeners more of a sense of where your research is going, looking forward and onto, into the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, all of the physical science research that kind of like bubbles along. I like to go out there. I try not to do too many flights, but so I tend to go out for a long period during the summer break, and we're going to continue to measure smoke. We're looking at what controls the composition of the smoke. Are peat soils affected by fertilizer, for example? Do they have different emissions characteristics than peat that hasn't had nitrogen added to it? Those kind of questions. But I guess really I'm most excited about the interdisciplinary work. I started to get very interested in how the issue was represented. Back in 2016, I went to a conference in Kuching, and the press releases were hijacked by the palm oil lobby. It's as simple as that, really. That all of the press releases suggested that palm oil on peat is sustainable and it's not a problem, whereas all the conference talks that I went to were saying the opposite. It didn't matter where the person was from in the world. If you worked in a university and you did research on peat, you knew this was a really bad idea. And that got me interested in the representation of scientific knowledge, the communication of science, and the kind of power networks that are behind, who controlled the press releases. And as a community of peatland scientists, we wrote a letter to Global Change Biology, and the title of the letter, I've got it written down here, is Denial of Long-Term Issues with Agriculture on Tropical Peatlands Will Have Devastating Consequences. And I later did some work with Felicia Liu, who's an associate at the Southeast Asia Centre, and this is the first kind of foray into the social sciences, because we looked at the media coverage of the conference and analysed how it was covered in Malaysia and Singapore, in Indonesia. And we also looked at whether the letter that we had written to Global Change Biology, whether that was covered by the media, and where. We found this remarkable similarity between the narratives that were used to promote palm oil and distract from the science about the unsustainable nature of the practice on peat, and climate change denialism in the US press. The idea that it's not a problem, it's not as bad as the scientists say it is, the scientists have vested interests. It turned out that we found all of these narratives in the press coverage of the issue as well. And the work that we've been doing, partly funded by the centre, has been to look at the haze season. So a lot of people take that for granted. Talk to anyone from Singapore, they'll say it's in September, say it's the haze season.
It's been naturalized or normalized.
Yeah, it didn't exist before. Well, we found the first mention of it in the early 2000s in media coverage. And I think when you work with social scientists and you spend time working in the region, you begin to ask these questions. What does that mean? What does it mean that the people call it a hay season, because and also who's controlling that narrative, who's promoting it, because as you rightly say, we found quite a lot of evidence in a media analysis of the way the term hay season, what is it associated with in the media, and we find it's almost exclusively associated with adaptation behavior. So wearing a mask, staying indoors, buying air purifiers. There's even like making sure you get a health checkup for respiratory problems. There's no association with the root cause of the hay season itself, which is the fires on peatlands burning. Often it's a transboundary issue. And so it suggests that just like summer in the UK or the wet season in Thailand, it's helping people to prepare for something. And it could be argued that the construction of this term hay season is a form of kind of crisis narrative, that you focus on the impacts, and that may distract from the root cause of the issue. And we find that it's heavily pushed by government officials, often using this term. And maybe the reason for this is that they would prefer people to normalize it, expect it to occur, rather than be upset that it's arrived. And I think that's really interesting. And still, we're just starting out on that kind of body of research. We've got a paper under review, and that was a media analysis. But what we really want to do is go and talk to people. And we've got a couple of students working on a project at the moment looking at the representation of hay season in the arts as well, because you often see murals on the streets of Kuala Lumpur, for example, that say haze is back, and that idea that it keeps coming back, that it's a season, is quite a powerful one, I think, and really looking forward to looking into that in more detail.
You have an interesting blog on this, co-authored in the Southeast Asia Center's blog series. But what you were saying about the role of the big palm oil plantation companies in the PR blitz to deny the impact, it's reminiscent of what people have seen with big tobacco, or big pharma, big food. Maybe we should be adding big palm oil to the list of companies that hire PR firms and otherwise engage in a lot of lobbying and sort of media control exercises. So the politics of it sounds very interesting and worth pursuing.
Yeah, Helena Varkey has done a lot of work on this. So Helena is an author of one of the blog posts that refers to this issue, and she was a visiting associate at the Southeast Asia Centre last year. And yeah, the palm oil lobby is a powerful one. I'm not against all palm oil. Palm oil is a really productive crop. It produces so much more oil per hectare than the equivalents in Europe, so rapeseed oil or sunflower oil. But on peat, it's just not a good idea. It's just so bad. No one benefits in the long run at all. It's a short-term gain for a few people because you produce the air pollution, you lose the habitat, you lose the carbon, and you lose the land. I mean, this is what's incredible, is that the soil disappears. It burns away or it decomposes. And in many of these low-lying regions, you end up with saltwater intrusion, and that's the definition of unsustainable. It's simply not going to be able to be used anymore. So yeah, palm oil on newly developed tropical peatlands is a very bad idea, but that fortunately is a small part of the palm oil business.
Well, many thanks, Tom, for sharing your time, your insights, and your research findings with us. We've been speaking with Tom Smith on dialogues on Southeast Asia. Please tune in for our future episodes. And if you're interested in Tom's research, check out the LSE's website and the LSE Southeast Asia Center's website, and you can find links to Tom's research. And we look forward to hearing more from him and reading more of his work, and to further episodes on other topics. So many thanks.
Thanks a lot, John.